Clemensen. Morning, Kelly.
Good morning. Morning, guys, gals. How's it going this morning? Have you got plenty of coffee? Staying awake? Yes? Okay. All right. I'm glad. We got the strong stuff. We didn't get any weak stuff. So eyes will be open, heads on. Yeah. Okay. So you guys have gotten some handouts this morning. Got some stuff on it. I'm going to kind of try to relate all the stuff we have so far, but we're still hanging on does God exist? So we'll get into the rest of it later. We're going to be on for the summer too. You guys come in, we'll maybe have the air conditioning on and everything. So we're going to continue on.
You got a handout. You got two handouts. We got two handouts. I was kind of interested in these Bible verses you handed me. What am I supposed to do with these things?
Well, I was kind of hoping to incorporate these, but
what's the handout about? Just
yeah.
give it a little intro.
So the handouts are kind of you're going to get objections, you're going to get all kinds of stuff from people you talk to, and what we want to try to prove is the fact that the Bible handles the objections in its own way. We've been talking a lot about evidences that we can see, but what we kind of want to do is get to the Bible so that we see that what we know and what we can rely on is the biblical text. And there's some stuff that this particular one that I want to start with. I just want you guys to think about this as we talk today. Just give it some thought in your head, because I think once we do that, I think it's going to be something that opens our eyes to the fact that the Bible does have the answers. There's some stuff that we can do that, like we've been doing, that shows, proof that God exists. But I think, as all of you know, you're here on a Saturday morning. The Bible's what we love, right? The Word of God is it, and want to make sure that we have that as the main principle. So,
well, I think about people just in general, and it seems like most people especially adults that have been around a while, realize that the answers aren't in the world, in nature, right? I mean, there's a lot of people groping around for meaning and answers, and I don't know, it seems to me that at some point we got to come out beyond ourselves and beyond humanity. Mm-hmm. And so the supernatural things about the Bible, maybe that's more welcome than we realize.
Yeah, there's some stuff in here that maybe disguised a little bit. That's a bad word. That's maybe not right on the surface, but it's there. And as you look at it, like every time I read the Bible, I learn something new, it seems like. Helps me through difficulties that I have. But it's there, and sometimes we just, like I do often, is just skip over it. So
right.
That's what I wanted to bring out. And this first one, just guys, keep it in your head as we go through all this stuff. And at the end, we're going to have a quiz. Just kidding. We'll just go around and see what you guys have to say after we're done. We want to try to incorporate your voices as well, not just me and Jay. So
sounds good. Well, now, the second handout, we've really kind of tackled the beast here, because we've been talking about, does God exist, and you got to fight evolution, and you've got objections, and so we tried to come up with a framework, and that's kind of what this is.
Yeah.
And we're not going to be able to drill down into every one of these. Maybe we can come and hit some highlights. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can come back to some of them or all of them in later meetings. But just overall, how do you see this framework fitting into what we're trying to accomplish?
Sure. I see this as an answer to what we're seeing in the world. When you talk about the Bible, somebody says, wow, that's some book written by men, Bronze Age book, why do you base your life on it? When you start talking about proof, you might get some answer like God of the gaps, and you guys have heard of that expression before or not. But that's something that we get when we talk with somebody that's, supposedly has a little bit of knowledge on why God might not exist. That's one of the things you're going to hear is God of the gaps. You guys are just talking about stuff. Since you can't prove anything, you just plug God into it all.
And I don't think, for me personally, I want to stand on the evidence for why God exists, but the fact of the matter is that we're just being bombarded by this evolution thing. I mean, it's just constant now. And, you know, you and I have come up with some, and I know this is maybe not an exclusive list, but here is, you know, what, 8 problems? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 9 problems with evolution. And there's probably many more.
Yeah, there's at least, there's a bunch, but those 9 are ones that you can address with someone in a conversational manner, that you can address these things and say, well, okay, well, you know, where does atheism, just an absence of God, where does atheism stand on this? Or anybody that's, you know, looking, saying, well, you know, even if they don't necessarily argue with you about it, they may want to hear, you know, reasons why you might believe. And then, as we also see in this, there's importance in what's been done in our lives, how it changed us, and that's a very important factor, I think, to make sure that, you know, you bring up some of this stuff about proof and evidence and things like that, but a lot of people just want to know, okay, well, why does this matter to you? But what difference does this make to you? And then you can go into why it is that you decided to follow God. And, you know, the fact that there's a God there, and, you know, there may be a little doubtful on that, okay, that's cool, we can address that. But me and Jay have both came similar, that me and myself, didn't have anything to do with Christianity. Somebody started talking to me about it, I didn't have anything to do with them. So get away from me about your stuff. But once I did want to find out about it, it was a calming evidence. And as the more I looked and the more I investigated, the better it got. And I know you have the same story, Jay.
Absolutely, very similar. Yeah, I was what I call a functional atheist. If you ask me, does God exist? Yes. Was I acting like it? No. But once I decided that I really wanted God, I desired God and a relationship, then I had the doubt process, and that's when a lot of this came to the fore. And the other thing was, in the early 2000s was when, at least to my radar, they were starting these debates where you had scientists who were Jesus followers were actually willing to take on the secular scientists. Yep. And that, of course, is continued on. Well, maybe we should just kind of go through each one of these points, starting with problems with evolutionary theory. You want to do that?
Sure, yeah.
So the first one, you know, matter coming into existence from nothing at the beginning. You know, they want to cram science down our throats. Does science even support that?
Well, I think a really good word to stick on here is matter coming into existence from, the good word is nothing. Now, what do we think of as nothing? That's an actual question, because what we believe as Christians is that nothing means nothing material. The 4 dimensions that we see, time, space, matter, and energy, that's something. And if that started, then it came from what I think what we would consider that as being nothing in our realm. But is it really nothing? We think there was a spiritual being behind it, right?
Right, and that's kind of getting to the next one, the first cause. But I mean, if you just look at science in the natural realm, you know, you pulling a rabbit out of a hat is a magic trick.
Yeah.
Right?
There's a trick.
Nothing. I mean, I guess my question would be, if somebody wants to stick to, say, the scientific method, how would the scientific method possibly prove something coming from nothing? I don't think it can it?
No, that's matter cannot be the cause of its own existence. Exactly. And it's
right. That matter cannot be the cause of its own existence. I mean, that's huge.
And when there's the idea of the parameters that we have, time, space, matter, energy, if we don't have any space, then we can't have any matter. If we don't have any energy, then if we don't have any matter, then where does energy come from?
Right, and maybe backpedaling a little bit, the secular physicists are acknowledging that there was this, excuse me, what they're calling this initial singularity. So they're confessing, so to speak, that there was no space.
Yeah.
There was no time, there was no matter, there was no space, there was nothing. Matter of fact, there were no laws of physics, because really the laws of physics are only describing what exists.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Describing how it all functions, describing the governing aspects of what we see.
So if
Gravity.
nature can't explain how matter can't create it, could create itself, which we know it can't, then does that then lead to the second thing about first cause?
It does, and it also leads to the words that when you talk to someone that's, maybe has a bad attitude about God, as soon as you mention supernatural, the whole thing flies off into a disarray. But all we're saying is there is nature, there's the natural, and it came into existence.
And there had to be something outside of
Outside of
nature
it, and
to
you would
cause it.
Call it super, it's above nature. That's all that really means. And when you use that word, that's when you get, oh my goodness, the stack starts blowing off.
But
all
maybe
it's
you
saying
can
is
ask
that-
questions to get them to admit that it's at least outside of nature.
Yeah, it's something, all that means is that it's something over and above what we see that cause things, and then other physics principles cause and effect.
Right.
If you have an effect, then there's a cause for it. I think we talked about that last time around, but all of us have one. My mom and dad are my cause. I'm the effect. They probably didn't like that effect for a while when I was a teenager, but and a little after that as well. But that's cause and effect, and we all have it. And like I think we talked about last time, and going backwards towards it. If I had a mom and dad, and that produced me and my two sisters and one brother, then before that, those four didn't exist. And my mom and dad had a cause and effect as well. And further back you go in back that direction, what do you get to? You get lower and lower population levels until you get to
Nothing.
two.
Or two, sure.
Two. And the question is,
Where did the two come from?
yeah,
So that's the million-dollar word or phrase, right? Infinite regression. There is no infinite regression.
right. That history thing, you can't just continue on backwards. That's just the idea that there's just a never-ending set of events in the past. Well, where do you get middle from?
Right.
You've got no ending past. Where's the middle at, right?
Well, I think at least there's some questions that we can raise in people's minds to get them thinking. I mean, the ball may not get over the goal line on is there a God, but I think that getting into this area, it ought to at least start to get somebody thinking.
Yeah.
Now, this next thing this is another one of these million-dollar words, abiogenesis, the theory that life arose out of inorganic matter. What's the problem with that?
There was C.S. Lewis said something about that. He said nothing, and this is kind of goes back, but it's kind of the same thing. His definition of nothing is what rocks think about. So so that's inorganic matter, though. Does a rock ever create to the point where it's got organic matter? Organic matter is what life comes from. But Louis Pasteur made the statement a long time ago that spontaneous generation, in other words, the idea that thing just pops into existence, no cause. That's something called spontaneous generation. And if you really think that happened, things popped like the rabbit out of the hat. Was the rabbit really in the hat? Did he produce the rabbit out of the hat because the hat had nothing in it? I think we know that's not true, right?
Right.
That's simple, but it's the same basic idea, right?
Yeah, I agree, and I think about there was people have been trying to play around with creating life in the laboratory, right? The test tube. This has been going on since the 1970s.
Yeah.
And so here you have, admittedly, very smart, educated scientists putting a lot of effort and probably a lot of money into trying to create life, and they haven't been able to do it.
No.
They
though
haven't
have
even gotten
intelligence.
close to it.
Yeah.
And the guy that I think about, and this might be something for a later time, is this James Tour, the molecular chemist and biologist who has looked at his several problems with it. And this is now getting awfully technical, but he's not ruling out that somebody could somehow possibly create it, but the problem with all of this is it still requires intelligence.
And he had 4 steps that he challenged the world to. And I don't have the 4 steps, but he had 4 steps he challenged the world to prove that this could actually happen from just chance. He had 4 steps. I'll get them and we'll talk about them next time. But he's also the interesting thing about James Tour that I love is he's a Messianic Jew. And he loves Jesus Christ. And he talks about it all the time. I love that fact that comes from somebody who, James Tour may be the eminent person on his topic, on his study, probably the eminent person in the world that everybody turns to when they start talking about this.
On molecules.
On
I mean,
molecules.
the guy's actually made molecules.
Yeah, he's a brilliant guy, and
He's written many peer-reviewed papers. Matter of fact, he was very, very highly esteemed and probably didn't have many critics at all until he got into abiogenesis and started questioning that.
Yeah.
And that's when the daggers started coming
yeah,
out.
that's when he started getting some stuff thrown his way. But he doesn't care. He's a smart enough guy to know where he's coming from, and he can make the debate.
So the point being then, here we're now, 50 years down the road, and with all this effort being applied by intelligent minds, they can't even come close to this.
No.
So the idea that randomness can do it seems very far-fetched.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about what evolution actually, what that process is supposed to produce, because I think that's interesting. It always was interesting to me. As soon as I heard that there was a God, somehow I know is either, okay, well, God did it or this did it. Let's see which one works the best. So explain a little bit about what evolution is, especially how the word has been used, because it's been used to lots of different things.
Well,
They say computers evolved.
right. Well, we know, for example, if you look at the origin of the species, there's what we call maybe microevolution or speciation, where within a genus, you can have different species. Species can change, right? They can adapt, so there's an adaptive quality, but none of that addresses how a new genus could come about.
New instructions.
A new set of instructions,
Right.
correct.
So, for example, there's panda bears and there's grizzly bears, but they're all bears. And the fact that there's that variation in them here's where I think it all fails. Because there is variation, like you said, there's leopards, there's lions, there's cougars, they're all cats. There's the home cat, house cat they've got that tends to take stuff up on our front porch and make sure they understand. So you killed it just for me. But that's the thing that's called about speciation. But when we talk about Genesis, it talks about kinds.
Which is
And
genus, right, to us?
It's genus, and it's not species, because there are different species. And let's talk about a little bit what Darwin actually saw, because there's some stuff that he was right about. Darwin did have some stuff that he was right about.
For sure.
And the big beaks and the fact that lizards ate on land and on the sea. Okay, but where this thing, it seems to me, where this thing fails at is the fact that these instructions that make a bird, they're very specific instructions in DNA that make a bird, and humans are too. You can watch a baby develop, and at certain times, certain things come into place. But what has to happen if this, once it came after Darwin, I think Darwin talked about it a little bit as well, he was trying to make this as an explanation of how species got here. And that's where it seems to me it fails, because if God built in variation into his creation, that's a good engineer, right?
Right.
An engineer will make, like the cars we drove up in today, they're engineered so they can drive them in the rain, they have windshield wipers, they drive them at night, they have lights. If you want to go off-roading, you get a four-wheel drive, it'll take you there. So they were built with that variation in them. And I see that as the birds that Darwin saw, the finches. The only thing he saw was the beaks getting bigger and smaller. That's really all he saw. And that made them a little bit more able to compete in the environment. But the environment didn't produce the beaks. The beaks were already there. It's just there was some variation on how big the beak was, whether it had a longer tip on it so it could gather food better. That type of stuff we understand is just all it is variation. God making his creation able to sustain itself. Another example would be dogs. Short-haired dogs and long-haired dogs. Short-haired dogs are better in warm climates, so they function better. And a long-haired dog in the heat probably won't function very well. Therefore, you want to say selection, like Darwin talked about, that selection, yeah, they probably will select it. But it doesn't, the environment, what they're trying to tell us, like what you would agree, is the environment is producing these changes. It's the other way around. The environment isn't adding any new information into the creature. All it's doing is just selecting what's already there.
Right, and so and this is getting, I think, really to kind of the cutting edge of genetics, that when you have, the finches are a good example, there were no genetic mutations to have that, it was gene expression, and this is where we're now understanding in genetics there's a difference between a genetic mutation and the genes that are already there expressing themselves. And so there's a thought that even within a genus, the instructions are there. Mm-hmm. It's just how they're expressed in the different species. And I don't know that that's definitive, but that's where this thing is headed. And then the problem that, say, a lizard becoming a bird, or however they think these things go, what I'm understanding is that if you start having genetic mutations, you can only have a few before that animal dies. Mm-hmm. And the amount of genetic mutations it would take to have one genus mutate into another, you've got a dead life form. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another issue, and Stephen Mayer got into that in his book, Return to the God Hypothesis.
Yep. Yeah. There's only so many of those you can have happen, and the mutation that happens, I mean, we all have them. It's obvious we do, and we don't get too far into this, but the reason why we bring this up is so that you would understand, everyone does understand, including us, it's when I learned it, was what's really being addressed when we get forced upon ourselves this evolution thing. What they're really trying to say happened. What they're really trying to say happened is that the very intricate and extremely sophisticated set of instructions that makes life, that's something that, generally speaking, when we look at that, it's specified complexity, it's the word. When we look at that, we know somebody's behind it. We know that. When you look at the space shuttle, you know that the trees and the trees and the weather and the rain and a hurricane and blowing through a junkyard is not going to produce the space shuttle. We know that. We know there was very intelligent people that did it. But what they're trying to say is that the actions of nature, heat, earthquakes, all these things can actually have a new set of instructions come into the life form. A new set to produce, instead of having, like you said, a lizard has 4 legs and a tail, but no feathers. There's some sort of situation and some string of random events that could actually make it so this lizard has only 2 legs and has feathers instead of scales. Now, if we look at that and look at the instructions that make a car, can you just, or let's say a software program is even better example, software program. If you throw a bunch of random keystrokes into a software program, what do you get?
You get an abnormal result.
Probably get something that's not going to function at all.
Correct.
Yeah.
Back to the dead organism.
Yeah, and that's what they're trying to tell us happened.
Well, and the other thing that Mary gets into, and I can see this, is that when you look at different animals, they've got a genetic sequence that would have to change to go from one genus to the next, and also the number in the backbone. So it's more than just the individual lines of code, it's the overall structure that would have to change without killing an animal. And see, this is where they can't show that.
Right.
They can't show how you can cross these lines where you don't have a dead creature. And then getting to what you said, and maybe this is getting to this DNA and RNA codes. What you were talking about, that the great example of a hurricane in a junkyard. Isn't that really like information? Isn't the problem? What's your take on that?
Information is this, and what we're doing right now is information. It's coded information. It's called English. So I don't know whether I have anything big enough for you guys to see. Let me see. That letter right there, can everybody see it? Mm-hmm. That's what we call as a G, right? Mm-hmm. Why do we know it as a G?
We're taught.
Yeah, we're taught
We
it.
know it because we're taught that represents a G. Is there anything about that mark that says G? I mean, can you scientifically examine that and examine why it says G? My point is, it might sound silly, but the coded instructions that everybody knows, nobody denies this. It's a well-experienced fact that DNA has coded information in it. And just like we have to learn that G is a G, same thing with DNA. It's actually coded instructions that have to have acknowledgement from each part, the DNA, the RNA, and the proteins, exactly what's going on. It has to be taught it. Just like we have to be taught English. If I was speaking Russian, well, John would be able to tell, but I don't know how many others could be able to understand what I'm saying, because we haven't been taught it, right? Nobody's ever gave us that information. So to me, that's the death knell of randomness producing things, just that alone.
Well, and the thing is too, and there's videos that are on YouTube about this, that DNA provides information, and the information is taken by the RNA and messenger RNA and moved around to create proteins. And so it's not just the lines of code in the DNA, it's actions within a cell that will go and grab some of that information to take that to create another protein. Well, how would it know to do all of that too? That's another information source, right? That's taking the English language and writing a story. Well, how would it know how to do all of that?
How does it know that any of it communicates together if they didn't understand? Like I said, if I was speaking Russian, Jay was speaking Hungarian, and somebody else was speaking Spanish, there's no way the three of us could communicate as to where we're going to go eat dinner at, right? Mm-hmm. I tried to figure out where Jay's going to go eat dinner. We're dead. I'm not eating. But here's something else that is important to understand. This idea of this long, slow process of changes, that would produce some evidence in the fossil record. It would produce what they call transitional forms. Mm-hmm. That would be, and this is so silly when you think about it deeply, this idea of the lizard changing into a bird. The only time that any of these changes are going to help him was when they're complete. He has wings, he has feathers, he has the ability to fly, he has a 4-chambered heart and a 3-chambered heart instead of a 3-chambered heart. All these changes have to be complete. All of them. But that's not what they say happens. They say it happens over a long period of time. If these changes that are supposed to happen over a long period of time, we would see some things called transitional forms, right? In the fossil record, there would be transitional forms.
Right.
There isn't one transitional form that's ever been found, a true one. Transitional form means that there's this appendage hanging off the side of the lizard that's not functional yet. And Darwin said that if this happens, what these small changes would make the creature more able to compete in his environment, right?
Right.
But how does this useless appendage hanging off the side of the lizard help him compete? That we've never seen. There's never been one example of that ever found. What about punctuated equilibrium? Talk about that. The one that Eldridge and Gould, are you familiar with that one?
You're going to have
Okay,
to school
all right.
me on this.
In the 80s, in the late 70s and the early 80s, there was a bunch of people, including the field director of Chicago's Natural History Museum, that said, if evolution actually happened along to a process that they promote, it happened without a single example of it in the fossil record. That's what he said, and he wasn't a Christian. Eldridge and Gould started to understand this. Guy's named Stephen Gould and Niles Eldridge. These are the two guys that started to realize there was a problem. And they decided, okay, this long, slow changing process, just like what we just talked about, how did this happen without a single example of it anywhere? We don't have a single example of it. So therefore they came up with this. These are guys that are atheists. And if you mention it, they get mad. But what they came up with is something called punctuated equilibrium. It's a long word, but all it means is that every once in a while you're going to have this happy monster come out, and a cat's going to give birth to a dog. That's what, now I'm simplifying it, but that's the basic idea behind it. It's not a long, slow changing process. It's one that happens instantly, and there really isn't any evidence for it.
Well, and this gets back to the fact that a mutation would kill the organism anyway.
Most of them do. They're
Right.
high 90s detrimental. But when you actually look at what the evolutionary product or gang, however you want to say it, how they look at this, you start seeing these problems that exist, that it's fatal. To me, it's fatal. They know these things way better than I do, but what I'm telling you is these are just facts. I mean, they came up with it, they looked into it, they saw there was no transitional forms, said, okay, we need to, what they should have done is told this silly theory out on the curb, but they didn't. They said, okay, well, if we can't have evolution, we gotta have God. Okay, well, that's not possible. So we have to try something different.
There's no alternative.
There's no alternative to materialism, because it has to be natural. And whether you want to try to say that, like this punctuated equilibrium, they call punctuated, in other words, every period, there's going to be long equilibrium, meaning long periods without any change. But then every once in a while, there's going to be a radical change. Like I said, a lizard gives birth to a bird.
Well,
I know,
and we now know that from DNA and whatnot that can't happen. So we're kind of touching on two. So the fossil record there in the outline, and also this irreducible complexity, because these transitional forms, the problem with that is that you need several different parts to have it function. And so that's another problem with punctuated equilibrium, as I would see it.
Yeah, it's convenient because supposedly it happens all at one time, and real convenient because you don't need to have any evidence anymore, do you? Before you had to have evidence of all these transitional forms that are around, but with punctuated equilibrium, the way they described it, then both of them said, well, since there's no evidence, then punctuated equilibrium works really well. We don't have to produce any evidence.
Well, I think getting
Because it all
back,
happened suddenly, right? There's no actual archaeology that could find it.
and these are purported scientists that are trying to push this kind of thing, and it's speculation, and it can't be backed up by evidence. It can't be duplicated.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, we've got an awful lot of genetics right now. They're not cloning one animal into another animal. They're cloning an animal into the same animal.
Mm-hmm.
And now that we know about this, the science refuses to back up that kind of speculation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, how about human consciousness? This is another one. Now, what is it about the human consciousness that would suggest that evolution isn't true?
Well, it seems to me that the idea of our minds and our thoughts, like we're portraying right now, It's not like my speech and my thought and my idea. You can't grab it. It's not something physical. And if the materialism that supposedly is supposed to make everything, how did something material produce something that's purely spiritual? Purely, I don't know how you describe it.
Ethereal,
spiritual.
or it's not tangible.
It's not tangible. You can't see it. My thoughts and what we're discussing right now, you can't see it. You can record it and listen to it again, but you can't grab it. I wish I could sometimes grab my words, put them back in my mouth, but that doesn't happen. But that's a spiritual thing, and consciousness on its own, the fact that we can love our wives. Mine's sitting back there. There she is. Yeah. I love my dog, but those type of things aren't. You can't go down to some sort of material causation for us to love something, to care about our friends. Things like that are not something that materialism can explain. Our emotions, our thoughts, the fact that we love God, that isn't something that's material. It's something we've grown to know from interaction with God. And you've had the same story as me. We interact with God, and it comes to the point where we start understanding he wants us to have a good life, and he portrays that to us by ways of like the guys that I talk to all the time, the atheists. Oh, you got voices in your head, do you? Maybe you should see a doctor. Yeah, I have voices in my head because God put them there. God put His Spirit inside me, and I know you don't understand that, but that's why I'm trying to explain to you that God does exist, and He's not a physical being. He's a spiritual being that speaks to us.
Right.
And He's done that several times to me.
Amen.
And I'm sure He has to all you as well. He's an active God in our lives, and He wants us to understand that He's there.
That's right.
And these are the type of things that help me. It's not all of it, but some of these things help me. When I started looking into these things and started realizing that God's best explanation for it, I said, okay, well, who is this God guy anyway? Yeah. Anyway, that took me down the road that way.
Very cool.
What about you, Jay?
Well, I cannot imagine how minerals, because remember they're saying it starts with minerals, inorganic matter. It's hard for me to understand how it could even cross into organic, into a life form, let alone something like a human mind. To me, that is the ultimate speculation, and it doesn't even appear logical to me at all. Objective morality, that's the next one. Now, that's something that kind of is problematic too, right?
But don't you seem like, it seems to me that everybody wants to have morals. Now, the morals may be skewed really bad, like, for example, Hitler's, but he had an idea where he was trying to get to. He had an idea he was trying to get to a better society that is, Darwin said Europeans were the most evolved humans, and the other ones were dragging down the humanity. That's what he thought. That's why he was going for this Aryan race. He had this idea. It was really bad what he did to try to achieve it, but he felt like it was morals. And I mean, when somebody looks around and tries to make up the morals, I think everybody wants to try it, right? You want to try to have a moral society. Morals being, people don't steal things from each other, right? If something's yours, why am I trying to take it from you? It's yours. It's not mine.
Right.
So that's something, I think that's a moral that most people like to have, but...
But why would we have it if there's evolution and survival of the fittest?
Exactly.
I mean, if I can steal and get away with it, that should be my ethic.
If evolution were true, then our idea when we have a relationship with someone we love, in particular the relationship of marriage. The relationship of marriage, from what God says, is that we need to have a relationship with just me and my wife, and there's no others coming in. Now, if you look at that from an evolutionary standpoint, that's the worst thing you could possibly do. How are you going to produce these extra generations if you're only having relations like that with one person? If evolution were true, you would want to have relations with lots. That's why you produce lots of people. you have more chance of evolution happening, little changes, but that isn't how it works. In fact, the idea of what God said is you can marry one person, and I haven't done that, so don't get me wrong. But what he's trying to say is that once you're in a marriage, you just need to stick to it and stay with that marriage because it's a beneficial thing for you to do. And we find out through STDs that's exactly what it is. Because if everyone had to follow God's design and married and everybody did it, there would be no STDs whatsoever. Because inside a relationship with one person for life, minus any injections you might get, but if everybody did that, then those things wouldn't exist, right?
Right.
And God said, this is how you're supposed to do it. But evolution's the opposite of that, right?
Right.
Because you'd have more mutations, you'd have more all this stuff that they say produces things. But yeah, morals. The other thing, it seems to me, that man, and man meaning the genus women and men, have we ever been able to produce a set of morals that everybody agrees on?
No, but I think there's certain things maybe everybody agrees on. I mean, you don't just kill a baby or
Right.
something, or maybe you do. But
Yeah, unfortunately, our society does. But people do have sets of morals, but they vary a little bit. And if they're objective, should they vary? Morals, what I'm trying to get at, I think I'm trying to get across is that has man ever been able to set a set of objective morals?
I don't think it can come from humans. I think it has to come from outside of us.
That's my point, is I think the only objective set of morals that we have is set from a transcendent source, because that gets man out of it. And we've proven from the start that we're not very good at following directions and morals. We've proven that from the start. That's the reason why we're in the condition we're in right now, is because we elected somebody other than God to run things. We'll get to that.
That's right. Well, that's a good segue into the last one here. Changed lives over centuries throughout the world. You know, I think of the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. Things should be falling apart. You've got this history, and we know going back even to what it says in the book of Acts, or you can read Origin, read in the 200s. We can see it all the way through today, where somebody is living a life of debauchery. They get exposed to the gospel. They go to God for forgiveness. They tell people I'm maybe they don't tell them anything, but to the observer, their life all of a sudden straightened around.
Mm-hmm.
They're living a more moral life based upon something that wouldn't happen, because if you start going down the road of debauchery, that it's going to lead to death, just like the Bible says. So I think we know that experientially. And how could so many people all of a sudden, with something, again, that's not material, all of a sudden have this turnaround? And it's happened millions, if not probably billions and billions of times now.
Yeah. I'm sure many of you, when you came to faith, there was a change. Tom? Was with me. I was 43 before I ever picked up the Bible to read it. And I was living the life that you just described, debauchery. And when this came around that I was going to decide to start following God, I had lots of friends that did all the stuff that we used to do, mainly drinking, but as you know, lots of stuff comes with that. And when I came to faith, when I started reading the Bible and started understanding God existed and that He's got some different ideas on how I select what I'm going to do, I started going out with my friends, and I'd sit down for lunch. They'd order beer and I'd order a Coke. They looked at me like, well, they knew what happened to me, but they looked at me like, well, what's wrong with you? Why are you acting like that? Why are you not using the language you used to use? And I'm not saying it's complete, but not nearly as often. And I think everybody here has that same idea. When you came to faith, there's something that changed, and the people around you, like you're saying, they saw it. Now, some of them rejected it. I have a good friend that I've grown up since second grade, and I hung around with him all the time. Once I came to faith, he didn't want to have anything to do with me anymore. nothing to do with me whatsoever. I wasn't a drinker anymore. I wasn't doing all the rest that came along with that. And so, well, you're boring.
And it wasn't even like you were trying harder necessarily.
Didn't
right?
try it. Just I decided that God exists, and I want to try to please Him if I can. And pleasing God is doing something that He wants you to do, as opposed to what I want to do, which I could see now as I look back. There's so many stuff I could tell you guys, and none of it is I'm proud of. But some of the stuff that I used to do, I look back on it and I'm just like, hey, what were you thinking? All right, I'll give you one story. I'm going to pass along one story. I played ice hockey for a long time, and before that I played street hockey. And I was the guy that was running the league in Buena Park, the street hockey league. And there was a Christian team that came into our league, and I wasn't very fond of Christians at that point. So 3 or 4 or 5 years before that, I went to saw the movie The Exorcist. And like I said, I'm not proud of this. I don't get the change. I'm just trying to give you an idea of the change that happened to me. This Christian team, I wanted to irritate them. So I got my jersey, and again, I'm not proud of this. I got my jersey and I put 666 on the back of my jersey, just to irritate the Christians I was around. That's where I came from. Not proud of that at all, but that's what I did. And when I look back on it now, I tell it because I'm just trying to explain the change that happened. But I look back on that and what are you doing? I didn't understand what that meant because I didn't read the Bible, but I just knew that it was something that this Exorcist movie said the Christians didn't like. So that's what I did. So that's the kind of change that happens with people, though, when people have those kind of stories.
And it's not natural. It seems like it's a change that's come from outside of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, a good way to conclude the problems of evolution, because in evolution that probably wouldn't be happening.
Probably not.
All right, well, let's move on to evidence for God and creation. The anthropic principle, I didn't put that down, but that's what the fine-tuning of the universe leading to an inhabitable planet. That's the anthropic principle. And so when we're looking at apologetics and the evidence for God and creation, why is that important?
I think that may be one of the best arguments we have. I can't remember who he debated. Christopher Hitchens. He's not an atheist anymore. He's dead. He saw God. He's not an atheist now. He was a guy that used to promote atheism quite a bit. And he had a debate with, I believe it was Stephen Meyer, but it may have been Frank Turek. But anyway, they rode in the same car back. Because he was actually a friendly guy. He just didn't like Christians. And once he got into a debate stage, you could really see that he didn't like Christians. But anyway, he was riding home with Frank Turek. And Frank asked him, he said, okay, Chris, what's the best argument you've heard that God exists? And he said, well, that's easy. It's the anthropic principle. It's the fact that this universe is designed for life. It has got specific ways that it functions, and I can't figure out how that could have happened without somebody putting it that way.
Yeah, we did talk about this last time, where one scientist, physicist, calculated the probability of this planet being the way it is 1 in 10 to the 255th power, I believe it was. That's a 1 with 255 zeros behind it. That's how improbable it was. I had heard from one source, read in one source, that all the particles in the known universe are 1 in the 10 to the 90th. So this is something way beyond multiple imaginable universes of chance. I've now heard that another person says it's only 1 in 10 to the 79th power. But either way, the improbability of where we are today, being here, just having a planet that would even sustain any life form, let alone us, is 1 in 10, 1 in a number, a 1 with 255 zeros behind it. And I wanted to share, I've been watching these Hugh Ross. Have you heard of Hugh Ross?
Mm-hmm.
he's an old Earth guy.
He is.
We got this debate. I don't want to
Yeah.
necessarily get into young Earth, old Earth
Right.
here, but he's got some interesting videos.
Mhm.
And there's two books I'm thinking about ordering. One is called Design to the Core, and the other one is called The Improbable Planet. And
I've heard of the second one, The Improbable Planet. There was,
Yeah.
I think somebody else was doing something similar to that. That it's unlikely for us for things to have. The eclipse that just happened. The reason why it's so incredible is that the Earth, the Moon, is a size where exactly the distance from the Moon to the Sun is precisely what it would need to be for the Moon to be able to cover the Sun orb exactly right. That has to be dialed into less than 1%, that we would be able to see the corona. The fact that those things are precise like that, that's another one of the astronomical principles. Things that, there's a bunch of them. It's detailed. Yeah, Dirk, you
I
got
wanted
those?
to just interject something I saw the other day. The scientists have discovered this planet supposedly 212 light years away, and they rate its habitability in order to have life on it, Earth-like life, as 0.86 on the scale, one being perfect, but 0.86. But they rate the Earth at 0.85. So I'm going, how absurd is that the Earth is uninhabitable according to them by 15%?
Mhm. That's
But
right.
that's the kind of thing that they're using to say, oh, well, there has to be other planets out there because we've decided that they're better to live on than this one.
Mhm. And all we need is water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
well, I would recommend the book that was out. It's out of print now. That was written, I'm going to say, about 20 years ago. Was called The Privileged Planet.
That's the one. Yeah.
But now because the thing is that astrophysics, we're getting better at it, and we're getting more data, with these telescopes and all these measuring devices. And so what Ross wrote this book because it's even less probable than what we knew 20 years ago.
Yeah. It's getting
And-
worse. It's not getting better for materialism. It's getting worse.
Well, I think my response to Dirk's comment would be that if somebody if somebody's coming up with that technical of a response, because remember now you're in way less than 1% of people you're ever going to encounter
Yep, that's right.
that are going to raise this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think the answer for that kind of person is, if you really want to do a thorough investigation of this, you ought to pick up the book Improbable Planet, because based on what I know, and again, I haven't read it, but I've been listening to this Ross, and I know a lot of what he said is in the book, and I'm listening to this stuff, and I'm realizing, no, this is radically impossible. He shouldn't call it the improbable planet, he should call it the impossible planet,
Yeah.
is the truth of the matter. All right, well, what about designs in nature? That's another thing that we can point to, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's basically what we've been talking about so far, is the fact that things were made to function where they're at. Fish are made to function in the sea. And this idea that at some point some fish crawled out of the sea, had different type of lungs, that it didn't need water inside of them, had legs, and all this stuff. This is what they're trying to teach us happened. And they just aren't made that way. Fish are not made to be on land, and neither are whales. They're made to be in the sea. They're designed for that, to be able to live there. And I personally think this stuff's unmistakable. Like, we're talking about this, and you say, well, they may be right, they may be wrong, okay. But if you really look at it, it's really, really hard to figure out how that kind of thing happened. How fish came up on the ground instead of in the sea. How did that all happen?
Well, I would point, the thing that I've been looking at recently is just the human body. And there's so many things about our bodies that we know about. Now, of course, these things occur in other mammals too, but people tend to study the human body because it's important to humans. And there's so many things that point to a design you've got signaling, you've got the microbiome, you've got just how all the systems interact. We've got the cell, the machines and cells, they know that now. That's, in Darwin's day, it was a blob of protoplasm. Now we know that there's all these things going on all the way down to the genetic level operating in a cell. So I don't know exactly how that would work necessarily in a conversation, but for us, seeing God in nature, we're seeing a design in nature to the point where I think we can be confident in saying, isn't that great how God created this, versus it evolved into that. Because the conversation is that somehow I evolved and my microbiome evolved and now we're all working together. No, God designed an entire package. And isn't it wonderful how he designed that? They say that there's a certain symmetry and a certain measurement, so the human hand and a spider and a lot of other creations, starfish, it's all mathematically the same or similar in terms of the proportionality of things. Okay, that's a design. That doesn't seem to be by chance. Isn't it interesting how God designed spiders and starfish?
Yeah, and the fact that they need to be the way they are right off the bat, but they don't work that way. There can't be this long process that put a little bit at a time. Put one leg on for now. You try to get around on one leg without eyes, whatever. It's just that slow changing process. It just doesn't work. The function of these things, and that's what the irreducible complexity talks about. The functionality of me and Jay and everyone in here is because we've got all the systems. Some it may not work very well anymore, but all the systems are here, and they function, and that's the reason why we're able to function. And when we have stuff happen like what happened with our friend Kevin, many of you know Kevin Ferguson. His system was working fine until he had a massive heart attack, and once that heart wasn't working anymore, Kevin's not working anymore, and that's where this whole idea of things coming along at a pace where this part, you guys, I'll give you 4 of the parts out. I'll give you 4 out of the 7. Go function. That just doesn't work that way.
Right. That's right. Okay, well then we back to irreducible complexity. That's what you just hit. So that's not only an objection to evolution, that's also something we point to with creation, that these things had to be created simultaneously is the point, right?
Yeah. And that's basically what we're just talking about, is that I gave you guys the giraffe example last time, if you guys were all here. Michael Behe came up with this, and what he was trying to say is the same thing, that a product functions because it's all together. Now, he did something else that was really simple. He picked up a mousetrap, and he said, okay, this mousetrap was designed to kill mice. You put a little bit of bait on this part right here, and as soon as the mice comes over and touches it, the spring comes down and we have no more mice. If you take away any part of that mousetrap, especially the spring, it doesn't work at all. It does the base. You can't attach anything. If the base isn't there, you can't attach anything to it. It's not going to work either. His point is that to be able to function, it has to be complete. The mousetrap doesn't have any chance of catching a mouse unless it's all there. And his same thing is with life.
Yeah, he had this flagellum. There was a cell that had this little whip. It would motor around with this thing that would whip around. But for that to work, there was 3, 4, 5 parts that had to all exist. One couldn't just, you couldn't mutate into the whip part if you didn't have the rotor part, or something like that. That they all had to, and he used that as an example. But this irreducible complexity is throughout life forms.
Oh yeah, it's all there.
Maybe every life form. I don't know. And then we already talked about existence of information in DNA. That's a thing that we can point to. If you have a code, you got to have a coder. The coder has to have information. It's not enough that there's a code. It has to be a functioning code. And there has to be knowledge for function. The functionality has to be built upon knowledge. Therefore, there has to be an intelligent mind that would have the knowledge and then could apply that knowledge for the thing to come into existence that way.
Yeah, with all of the parts being able to pass along the information that comes to the construction process. It's a blueprint. DNA is basically like a blueprint for a construction project. And especially if you're talking to a contractor that may not think God exists, tell them, well, where'd you get your blueprint for the last house you built? Where did that come from? And it's just some of that stuff that I think is interesting to use when you have someone that's maybe have some questions, honest questions about whether God exists. These are the things that help. That especially with a contractor. Says, yeah, I understand. There's a blueprint. There's a guy that's the major contractor that makes sure all the guys on the outside are doing their job properly. It seems to me like that's DNA, RNA, and the proteins. That's same thing, same line of reasoning.
All right, well, the next one's insufficient time for required genetic mutations, and this is another thing that goes against the punctuated equilibrium. Now, Stephen Mayer, in, I believe it's Darwin's Doubt, and there's a video on this as well at the Heritage Foundation, mathematically, the genetic mutations needed, there's a time. So even assuming that these mutations wouldn't kill the life form, a protein fold takes so long, and the number of protein folds to create the amount of life on the planet that we know, there's never going to be enough time. There never would be enough time.
Yeah.
And so and the one thing that makes that clear is the Cambrian explosion, where we know locked in the rock is all of a sudden these animals appear. And it's within a finite tens of millions of years, and it's beyond trillions. It's beyond quadrillions times quadrillions times quadrillions. It's a fantastic number. There is no number for it, and so we know it can't have happened.
Yeah, the Cambrian explosion also shows that all the major animal phyla, that they call phylites, I'm going to say kinds, all the major kinds of animals are in that explosion. Every single one of them. And the strange thing about it is, there's no development process whatsoever seen. There isn't one fossil in the Cambrian explosion that has some sort of a distant relative, like evolution's supposed to have. And again, that's the reason why they changed its theory. But these are all things that are well known. So what falls into my mind when I think about this stuff is, why are you hanging on to this? Why are you keeping this idea in your head? Because the stuff's there. We're not making this stuff up, and it's not creationist stuff. It's just simple facts. The Cambrian explosion is a simple fact, and everybody knows it. And all the animals came in, and they appear exactly like they are right now. And there's no changing around. None of this stuff going on.
Right, and then we've got two more that we've kind of already covered to get through the outline here this morning. The human mind and emotions, we can point to that. We can point to, like you said, love. We can point to beauty.
Yeah.
We can point to emotions. There's this concept in the law that you cannot give that which you do not have. And so the human mind and the human emotions must have come from a source that possessed a mind and possessed emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why would he make emotional? Why would God make an emotional being if he's not emotional?
Right.
Why would he do that? That seems, if he's this distant deity, like many people have talked about. Even ones that do believe in God think it's this far off God that doesn't care anymore. Why would he make animals? Why would he make humans like us that actually have that emotional connection?
Right.
Have friends, have spouses, have all these things. Why would he make it that way if he wasn't that way himself?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. And then the last thing here is a biblical worldview aligns with objective reality. And I think that really has to do with what God originally made it good, and then there was corruption, and we can see beauty, and we can see corrupted beauty. I mean, maybe that's a way of putting it. How would you express that?
I think, let me read a couple verses here, because you run into this all the time. The objection section we're going to get into now. You get into the objection section is people will ask you, well, if God's so good, why do we have so much disaster? Why do we have cancer? Why do we have people dying? All the injustice that goes on? Luke chapter 4, verse 6. I will give you authority over all the kingdoms and all their glory. He, Satan, said, for it has been relinquished to me, and I can give it to whom I wish. Also, 2 Corinthians 4:4. In whom the God of this world has blinded the minds of them who believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine upon them. And let me throw this out to you guys. What are those two verses telling us? Anybody? Who's in charge here?
Satan.
That's what those two verses are saying. Satan's in charge here. Is that because he's more powerful than God? I think we know that's not the case. It's because there was an election held. I feel there was an election held. If you read Genesis 3 and Genesis 2 and 3, God instructed Adam and Eve on how to stay in the garden and have a perfect life. And they decided that they wanted to do exactly the thing God told them. He said, you can eat of any tree in the garden, but you may not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden. Otherwise, you will surely die. And that's what they did. Well, we won't get into specifics. That both ate it. And now that election was held. And the vote count was 2-0. The two that were supposed to be hanging on God's word, they decided they want to hang on that anymore. For whatever reason. I'm not sure that I wouldn't have done the same darn thing. But when we start getting objections from people saying that, okay, well, there's disasters on earth, why does a good God allow that? Now, to me, that's their best argument. I feel that's their best argument. It's not a very good argument, that's the best one they got. But if I've had several people get kind of upset with me about saying this, but it's biblical, that even Jesus said, Satan's in charge here. And the things that you see going wrong, we're laying it, and if they say, well, why does God allow this? We're laying it at the wrong desk. What's going on here now is Satan's in charge here. There's a few of us that don't want to have him in our lives. That's good, but still, we're still dealing with him. We're still dealing with his influence on the world.
And as I've heard it said, evil is the absence of God. So back to your election, before the election, there really wasn't evil in God's creation or corruption because it was all of God. And then once that election got held, then there is a part set apart from God, where a different direction. I mean, you could say ungodly. I mean, you can almost use what ungodly and evil as synonyms, right?
Yeah. It's the fall. Everybody knows the fall, but it's just and I'm trying to blame Adam and Eve, but I'm the same way. There's times when I want to follow what I think is right instead of what God thinks is right. And that's why we're in the position we're in. It's not God's fault. God set up a set of rules that work great. They look at the Ten Commandments. There's nothing wrong with those. There's not a single thing wrong with that. And if we set up our lives and our societies on those 10 guidelines, we wouldn't have any wars, because that's coveting. We wouldn't have any death, because we might have that just because we're going to die in our old age. But there's a lot of directives in there that would make our life a lot better. But we don't follow it, and when you don't follow it, who's in charge?
Right.
So I think when that objection comes up, it's important to remember that the Bible doesn't say that God's running things now. It says he was running things at first in the garden, but he's not running things now.
Well, and I feel it's important to go back to the book we've had, and that's Cold Case Christianity, and the point that J. Warner Wallace is making is you've got all this evidence for God. Are you going to throw all that out because you can't understand why?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a fair question to ask. And that's not how we decide trials. I mean, he's certainly used the criminal case, the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. And what are we told to do as jurors? We're told that we're supposed to look at the totality of the evidence. We're supposed to weigh the evidence.
The grand total of it all.
The grand total. Now, the existence of evil may create some doubt, but in light of all the other evidence that we have, is it really reasonable doubt? And this is where we get the kind of the stiff hand thing. Because if a person is just bent on, I just don't want to come to God, I don't want a relationship with God, I don't desire God, okay, then yeah, they're going to latch on to one thing. So the question, I think, becomes, in the context of the discussion, how can I pull that person back into considering that question or that issue in light of all the other evidence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you may be talking to a person who's analytical, may like to have all the little details. Or you may be talking to somebody that's emotional that would, better align with the spiritual side of things. That God loves them unconditionally. But this way, it seems to me that what we can have when we consider both is that we have the ability, like Paul said, to no matter who he's with, he's able to show Christ to them, and he wants to do it, whatever it is. If he needs to apply or conform to the Jewish guidelines to be able to be with the Jews, so you can tell them about Christ, that's what he'll do. And if he's with the Gentiles, he's not going to be as strict about the Jewish code anymore, because that's not us anymore. The Jewish code isn't how we live anymore. So,
and it was probably foreign to most of them anyway.
Yeah, most of the people he talked to didn't know anything about it anyway.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, now you and I, before we started, we talked about where we'd go from here, and it looks like we probably don't have time for the third thing, but we talked about questions.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe
is it past 11:30 already?
Looks like it.
I didn't get to my verses. Okay, let me read these just so you guys can go home and think about it a little bit. Well, let's read it. Then I'll take one.
Let's do it.
Sorry.
Okay, you go.
So it's John, 2nd chapter of John, verses 1 through 9. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus was there.
And Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding.
When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine."
"Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come."
His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you."
Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons.
Jesus said to his servants, "Fill up the jars with water." So they filled them up to the brim.
Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so.
And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. So, like I said, a lot of times we see scriptures, and that's a neat story because Jesus is at a wine. He's trying to make this celebration continue. But seems to me something's hidden in there because Jesus just made wine. And what does it take to have wine? Time. So Jesus just interrupted time and made something that takes. If you're going to make wine, you got to put seed in the ground. Plants got to grow up. The grapes have got to mature. You got to take the grapes, put them in somewhere where they're going to ferment. And Jesus all did it in a short time. And Luke chapter 7, verse 9 and 10. Jesus marveled at this. He turned around and said to the crowd who had followed him, "Listen, everyone, never have I found among the people of God a man like this who believes so strongly in me."
Jesus then spoke the healing word from a distance. When the man's friends returned to the home, they found the servant completely healed and doing fine.
So what did Jesus do on that one? Did he control space? He controlled space. Now he's doing all this in a first century people that had no idea about our dimensional reality of time, space, matter, and energy. He's just doing this to show something. I think he's trying to show something to us now. And Mark 4:35 through 41. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side."
Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along. Just as he was in the boat, there were also other boats with him.
And a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped.
Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?"
He got up, rebuked the wind and the waves. "Be quiet, be still." The wind died down, and it was completely calm.
He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?"
They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So why I brought these verses up is I've thought about these for a long time, and like it says in Genesis 1, and what Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose said in the 70s, that time, space, matter, and energy all had a beginning. It had a beginning, that it had somebody that controlled it. And it seems to me that these verses are telling us exactly what we need to know. And it's only coming from the Bible. It's not coming from some dude that's got a lab coat on. It's coming from the Bible. It's telling us what Jesus had control over. And he did it right in front of people so they would recognize it. He wasn't hiding anything. He was doing it right out in the open.
Yeah, back to case or the cold case Christianity, I felt that Mr. Wallace made a very good argument for the fact that the Bible was written, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 1 Corinthians, Acts, all at least those books, before AD 70. Mm-hmm. Okay? And that the miracles are in there. The miracles were a public knowledge. There was a public assertion in writing about all these miracles. And yet there is no writing for somebody that would have knowledge. In other words, somebody in and around Galilee or Jerusalem saying, no, that did not happen. No, there were not all these healings. No, that wedding didn't happen. And there are secular writings that are critical, as he pointed out. These are not Jesus followers. They point to him, but there's nothing in any writing back then, which is the relevant time period, not what somebody's writing in the 1800s, but something, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it really needed, what's the writing before the temple got destroyed, or at least by, say, AD 200, where they said, no, there was this guy and his name was Levi and he was there and none of this happened. This is all made up by these apostles, as these critics claim now. There is no writing. And I think about how vicious the Jewish leadership was, not only on Christ, but also on Paul and the rest of these apostles. They died. Sure, yes, I agree with Wallace. Yeah, they died and they didn't make it up. But the fact of the matter is that there would continue to be this opposition, and surely had these miracles not been true, somebody would have come up with something and we'd have a writing about this.
Mm-hmm. Instead, we have non-biblical writers confirming it. Tacitus, he was a Roman senator, and you look it up, you put in Google search Tacitus on Jesus, it'll tell you that number one, that Jesus was crucified, number two, is done in Palestine, and number three, it was done by Pontius Pilate, and this what do you call it, a significant superstition that these people felt. Now, he doesn't say that was the resurrection, but that's what I feel it is. If you read it, it says something about superstition, I think infamous superstition, something wording like that. But he's saying that this all happened, and then this superstition came around, and it's still here to this day. He's writing this history about 116 or so, but he was alive during Nero's reign, and Nero was killing. What he's writing this about, he's writing about Nero. He wasn't writing about Christians. He just happened to get on it because Nero blamed the burning of Rome onto the Christians, and he said, okay, these Christians, this is what they're from. There's this guy named Pontius Pilate crucified this Christos guy, they called him, in Palestine, and this was a big event 30 years later that he's writing about, that these Christians are around. And there's lots of other ones, including there was the Jewish lawyers who had a debate with Polycarp. He was a late first century Christian disciple of John, and he came to this debate with these Jewish lawyers, and he was complaining because the Jewish lawyers said that Jesus did his miracles by the work of sorcery. That's interesting. They confirmed something there, didn't they?
Yeah, that's an admission.
That's an admission that he did the miracles. Now, they're not liking that he did the miracles, so he tried to say blame it on Satan. But the fact that the miracles happened are not disputed. Like Jay said, for 1800s, there's nothing disputed. 1800 years later, textual critics got on it. But these guys are 1800 years after the fact. If I want to see a story, and I want to know the truth about it, I'm going to want to know from somebody who was there. That's just logic.
Right, and that's back to this guy who's kind of looking at court proceedings and evidence, saying, where's your competent evidence?
Yeah.
Were you there? You see, these guys that have come up with this stuff, starting in probably the late 1700s, they weren't there.
Mm-hmm.
They're not witnesses.
No.
And and the other thing is, of course, the resurrection, and you've got 1 Corinthians 15, that again, Wallace makes a good argument that had to have taken place before AD 70, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Right? When you tie it in with the book of Acts and whatnot. 500 people saw the resurrected Jesus at once, many of whom are alive to this day.
That means he's talking about this not as a future event. He's saying you can go to people, talk to people right now, they're still alive.
Right,
So that has
and
to be
nobody
within-
did that, and then wrote a thing. Where's the Jewish writing? They didn't want this. They didn't want Jesus. They didn't want these people. They wanted to kill them in prison. It wasn't like they were ambivalent and they just let these guys go. They were trying to tamp this thing out.
Oh, yeah.
Surely, Paul opened up this is this thing where you go out on a limb and you wonder if the guy's coming behind you with a saw.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he went out on a limb with that, and there was nobody with a saw.
Nope. No, there wasn't. It's some of the stuff I've read, they correlate this to modern times, because these books were written most of them written within 30 years or so, some of them before that even, from the time that the crucifixion happened. Some people think Matthew was written in the early 40s, but some people think it was Mark. But anyway, 20, 30 years after the fact. So if we put that into our time frame, in something that we've seen and we understand, and a book was written about it, like a book was written about these things. If a book was written today, and the source of the book was that John F. Kennedy was assassinated on the front porch of the White House with a bow and arrow, we would look at them and say, well, what the heck are you talking about? We know that isn't true. That never happened. John F. Kennedy was killed in Dallas by a gunman. We have video of it. Now, in those days, they didn't have video. But my point is, that book that guy tried to sell, he would have a hard sell. Because we know that didn't happen. And that's the same thing for the New Testament. Now, they didn't compile it into a book until later. But still, those stories were around on those events. And if those events didn't really happen, people would be laughing at them. But they weren't. The Jewish authorities were trying to tamp it out, trying to blame the miracles on Satan. They weren't saying they didn't happen.
They didn't come up with a body, and they didn't come up with credible witnesses to say the miracles didn't happen and the resurrection didn't happen. Otherwise, surely we would have a writing.
If the Jewish authorities had been able to produce a body, none of us would be sitting here. I sure wouldn't be. If they could produce the body and show that it was Christ, I wouldn't be. None of us would be sitting here. I wouldn't think you guys would be.
Right. Right.
But they couldn't, and they admitted it.
Very good. All right. Well, maybe this is a good time to close this down.
Yeah. You want to pray for us, Jay?
Sure. I'll pray real quick. Lord Jesus, thank you very much that we could come here today to learn about your creation, to learn about the arguments and the evidence for you. As the Bible says, it was all created by you, for you, through you, and that you hold it all together. And just help us to remember that you are the one that are holding things together, and that we love you, we have a relationship with you, and that no matter what we're going through in this life, we can come to you. We've got free access. We have a loving Father. We know you love us, and we thank you for that. And just help us to have the proper attitude, the proper spirit. We all want the right words, but Father, help us to have those other qualities, those intangible qualities that would even make the other person desire a relationship with you. That no matter what we may be able to say, Lord, we need to have those things from you that would just inspire other people around us to want you, to want a relationship with you. So I just ask for travel mercies as we leave here, and we just continue to look forward to all the things that you're going to do, Father. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thanks for coming out, guys. Sorry we held you up a little bit, but now you have a good readiness for lunch.